This is the My Campaign Coach podcast, where we talk about how to win elections. Every week, we let you hear straight from the best consultants, operatives, and candidates in the game, all for one reason, to help you win. For more information about how we can help you win, visit mycampaigncoach.com. Now, here's your host, Raj Schaefer.
Welcome to the How to Run for Office podcast from My Campaign Coach. Many thanks to Campaign Sidekick for supporting this podcast. You can visit campaignsidekick.vote to find out how their best-in-breed voter contact platform can revolutionize your campaign and help you win. I hope you guys had as great a Easter and Passover as I did. We got to spend a lot of time down at my family's ranch, polishing my shooting skills, catching some fish, and eating plenty of my mom's fine cooking. Plus, my little man Stoney just hit 6 months old, and so we had plenty of grandparents and great-grandparents on hand to spoil him rotten, and we had a great time. This week, though, I'm glad to be back with a new interview. We're going to be talking to Steve Beren, owner of One Spark Marketing out of Washington State. Now, Steve's been working in the political consulting field for a number of years, has run for office himself, and is a longtime activist for the last couple decades in the Washington State GOP. Now, the really interesting part, though, is that through the first couple decades of his adult life, Steve was a radical leftist. He was a union activist, leftist infiltrator, socialist, and anti-war radical. And that's hardly the avatar of someone you'd figure would become a conservative, let alone a successful Republican consultant later in his life. Steve's conversion story that he shares with us today, and his advice on what he calls the holy trinity of political campaigns, is absolutely fantastic. And I think you guys are going to get a lot out of our conversation. Plus, towards the end of our conversation, we go in depth on Steve's consulting model, how he's built his business, and what he feels has been critical to his success, which I think is a good starting point for anybody that's of y'all that is thinking about becoming a political consultant or wants to make a full-time job out of working in political campaigns. As you're listening today, I'd love it if you could take some time and give some thought to how you'd like me to improve the podcast, who you'd like me to have on in the next couple months, and ideas for how we can create more value from My Campaign Coach into your campaigns. So any of that advice would be great, and you can shoot me an email to raz@mycampaigncoach.com or go to our Facebook page under My Campaign Coach and shoot me a message. Either one of those is going to get to me quickly, and it'll be really, really helpful as I'm trying to streamline some internal processes and make sure that we're providing maximum value to all of y'all that are listening, engaging on Facebook and our mastermind group, and contacting me directly. So with that, let's get to the interview. Steve, it's great to have you on the podcast today. Thank you so much for coming on.
Raz, I'm very glad to be on and look forward to our discussion, and I hope it's helpful to people who are interested in winning political campaigns.
Well, I definitely think it will be. It's looking at your background and looking at what you've done online and examples of that, as well as talking to you a little bit. It sounds like you've got quite a resume, and I love to just kind of jump in. So you started out in New York, and you've ended up on the other coast. You've gone from coast to coast. You've done a lot of political work, and you got a really cool kind of crazy background. Let's kind of start walking through where you come from. What got you involved early on, and how your life has evolved to where it's at today.
Well, about me, I'm 66 years old. I'm a very young 66, and I'm a native New Yorker, although I've lived out here in Seattle, Washington for the last 30 years, or actually 31 years. I came here in 1987. But as a teenager, growing up in the 1960s, I was a part of the radical generation of protesters and anti-war activists, and supported the Black Panther Party, and even joined socialist. Many young people at that time would join socialist, communist, anarchist groups. In their freshman year in college. And one thing about me that was a little different, instead of spending 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years in that radical milieu, I stayed from 1968 to 1990. I was a far left socialist radical activist. I was pro-Cuba, pro-Palestinian, anti-America, and only in my 40s did I, out of exhaustion and out of a lack of success of socialism, kind of drop out of politics. And so on the one hand, I have a lot of insight into the left, which helps conservatives and Republicans in, it's good to understand the messaging and the arguments of the other side. I have some insights into that, but also the very far left radical movements you're living politics 24 hours a day. And so even in the interest of a bad cause, you learn methods of persuasion and methods of arguing and what works and what doesn't. And believe it or not, that can apply across the board. There are methods that win people over and frame your argument better. I'll elaborate on that later, but for about a decade, I was just a civilian, just working in an office, just pursuing a career, doing in my 40s what most people do in their 20s. And then 9/11 came. And when 9/11 came, I, like everybody, was traumatized and angry. And I felt I wanted I knew what had happened during the Vietnam War. I knew what I had done against my country, during that time. And I thought, even right on 9/11, 9/12, 9/13, I thought, the left is going to divide the country over the war on terrorism. It's not going to be a unity situation. And I started going on the airwaves as a guest, and people liked to have me on, former communist, leftist radical, now a patriot. And eventually that led me to be active in conservative and Republican politics in Washington State, where I had moved in 1987. And I ran for Congress against Jim McDermott in 2006 and 2008, right in the heart of Seattle. And I learned a lot through that. And since then have been campaign manager and senior advisor to, some very prominent campaigns. I did consulting for Newt Gingrich and for Joe Miller in Alaska and for, Senate and gubernatorial candidates here in Washington State. I will say, think about it. Your audience, when you have changed your mind, have you ever changed your mind on on some political issue?
I have indeed.
Right? And that's a good thing, right? If you're a candidate and someone is supporting the other candidate or doesn't agree with you, persuading and changing their mind, that's good. That will increase, then that some people will vote that they voted for the other guy last time, but they'll vote for you this time. Well, but then how to persuade? Well, if you think about it, people's instinct is to insult or mock or dismiss or yell at someone and get into an argument. Just look at what happens on social media.
Right.
Look at the division in our society. However, that never changes anybody's mind.
Not at all.
If you think about what changed your mind, it was probably experience combined with information and sensible, reasoned discussion. Now, that's more difficult than yelling at someone, but more effective. And I strongly recommend.
No, you're 100% right, and that's a pet peeve of mine because, and I've shared this before, I think, but it's a lesson that I learned pretty early on. I had a little bit different trajectory than you. I grew up and got involved in politics when I was 10 years old, when working on a state rep race with my parents in '96, and I was a homeschool kid. I was fairly sharp. I loved talking about issues, politics, etc., and I loved engaging people on that. But at that time, as a result of my immaturity, that whole the kind of arguments that you see on Fox and here on Rush Limbaugh and others, where they're very much attacking and you're showing off for the people that are listening. That was my style as a 10 and 12-year-old, and I was a little smart ass, and so I loved that. But it got to the point where I realized, and my parents clued me in on this, is like, look, Raz, if you're gonna treat people like this, yeah, you'll corner them and you'll devastate them logically, but you're going to lose a lot of friends that way, and you're not going to convince a single person to change their mind. What might be more effective is if you had a little bit different style, and one that's more Socratic in nature, where you're asking questions, you're planting seeds, and you're in, as Sun Tzu talked about, you're giving them a golden bridge across which to retreat. And so for me, I figured out that if I actually wanted to do the constructive thing, actually build the people that believed in the same things I did, then I needed to have a very different tact where I was not as direct. I was definitely not attacking, where I actually asked questions. I planted those seeds, and I was willing to let those germinate over time instead of you accept someone's unconditional surrender right in front of me. And it turned out with that, I was able to keep a lot more friends, and I was able to, I think, actually increase the number of people on my side of a given argument. But
right,
you're right.
Absolutely. You and I are of the same mind on this. If there were an intellectual code of conduct, and I realize there's also, a political instinct to say, why should we be nice? The other side's not nice. But the reason you should be nice is, and this is my own opinion, if you look at the left, and I'm not talking about just a civilian who's a moderate Democrat, but if you look at the far left, that is the very logical, if you took to the logic, the most extreme, left, well, you have North Korea dictatorship, Russian dictatorship, Cuban, Venezuela, right? Now, that's not the left that we're facing in America, except on the fringes. But we see that the tendency on their side of things is restriction or attack or diminishing of free speech, avoiding substantive arguments. And my theory is that there's a spectrum, but it tends on the left in the direction away from substantive argument in favor of mockery, hyperbole, ad hominem attacks. And that's the Alinsky method. Well, a lot of discussion that I hear, and we see it on the internet, Facebook and Twitter, social media, is, and like you said, on cable TV, both on the left and the right, is, well, the other side is mean. Why should we be nice? And then you get into the mud and in the argument. But I'm an advocate, and since I grew up on the left, I know about the Alinsky tactics of mockery, insult, dishonesty. Those methods do not serve to persuade, and that's not the left's goal. Again, with all proportions guarded, there's a spectrum, and it applies less to a moderate liberal and more to a communist. But their main goal of American liberal progressive movement is not so much to persuade people to have a certain view, but to pressure and to coerce. Yeah. It's not to convince people of a certain interpretation of the Second Amendment, but to get around the Second Amendment, let's say.
Yeah.
And so I advocate that Republicans and conservatives, especially if you're running for office, but this just goes, that you're not going to win people over with Alinsky methods, because the nature of it is to avoid substantive argument. If we want to talk about, and on some other show we could have full discussion of these issues, but if you want to explain the U.S. Constitution, the roots of the American Revolution, federalism, limited government, the free market, how the economy works under capitalism, that requires not mockery and insult, but persuasion, education, and discussion. That's one of the reasons that it's, we have a sorry situation, in our educational system. Well, where this relates to candidates is a certain percentage of people who are running for office will be running, in response to the arguments and the battles that are going on, and then they imagine that what works for Donald Trump, that's really a very unusual and exceptional situation, and that is not really good. If you or I are managing someone's campaign, or if anyone listening to this podcast is, working on someone's campaign or managing their campaign or advising or running themselves for office, you wouldn't advise them. Just do the same. Just make fun of your opponents, insult them, and tell them you're the greatest ever.
Not at all.
Right. There's history will write why it worked for this one person, but it's not an effective way, and it doesn't have long lasting results. I question whether more people understand the U.S. Constitution, or more people understand trade policy, or more people understand federalism or limited government now because Hillary Clinton was defeated. Thank God. I don't think that much progress has been made on that. So it's like it's a very superficial base. And if you're walking on a superficial base, you could fall down and slip through the cracks. So I worry about that. With candidates, I want candidates who are know whether they can win or lose, because it's okay to run in a district where you can't win, but then you should know that you can't win. And they should know the purpose of their campaign. For example, I ran for Congress in Seattle. No chance to win. Usually Republicans get 12, 15%. I got more, but 20, 21% when I ran against Jim McDermott. But my purpose in running, of course, I knew I wasn't going to win. In fact, the way it came about was that I proposed to the King County Republican Party. I spoke to their chair. I wasn't thinking that I would run. I was saying, have someone run, but if you don't select someone good, you're going to have a crazy person representing the Republican Party, and you're not going to make any gains. Yeah. Why not run someone good, have them have a focused message, go on the radio shows, make a few speeches, make a good image, and do some networking. And of course, they said, "Okay, why don't you do that?" So
Great
I
idea,
did,
Steve.
right, I did it in 2006 and 2008. I raised a lot of money for a totally unwinnable race. Had many hundreds of radio commercials. Got lots of media coverage, and then I have a unique background, as we've discussed, so that got into the press. But at that time, 2006, 2008, I knew, even from my socialist days, right? When you had a protest, and this is why this applies to far left, moderate, liberal, conservative, whatever. When there would be a protest on the war in Vietnam, the protest would say, pull the troops out of Vietnam. That's what it would be about. There'd be a million other people at that protest. They'd have all kinds of opinions on everything, but it would be focused. Now, in retrospect, it's something I don't agree with, but it was focused. It was effective. The civil rights movement, they would have a march on Washington. We want the president to sign the civil rights bill. It was a focus. So I knew that in any hey, you get on the local radio station says we're going to have you on for a 10-minute segment. You can't go into 50 different issues, and you can't just pontificate. You're only going to get a few sentences here or there. So a campaign, I feel, should have 2, 3, and at most 4 main issues: taxes, foreign policy, whatever, transportation, whatever the issues are that candidate wants to get out. And they should stick to that message. And if other issues come up, they should look for a way to steer towards their core message of the 3 or 4 points. And to me, that's axiomatic in a campaign. But it's so easy for people to get pulled off track. Now, a skilled campaign manager or political consultant, which I like to consider myself, and I'm assuming that there are budding and potentially skilled political consultants and campaign managers listening to this podcast. That's where your work comes in, to coach a candidate and to teach them and show them how to not get knocked off track, how to make a pivot without sounding like you're avoiding an issue, how to answer a question on a lesser issue and bring it back to a more important issue. But the discipline of messaging is crucial. And I call that one of the 3 points of the holy trinity of campaigning. Knowing what your message is and staying focused on it throughout. Your yard sign, your robocalls, your printed materials, your speeches shouldn't be wildly different. They should, one way or another, point people back to those 3 or 4 points. And that means thinking. I had one candidate once call me up, a Florida candidate that was going to run for city council in their community. And they said to me, Steve, you're a smart guy. I've filed, ballot status, and I'm going to be in the city council race. And here, I'm in Seattle. I've never been in that person's town, right? They said, what do you think are some good issues for me to run on? I thought, well, I'm going to not get a client here because they're not going to like what I'm going to say. And I said, well, look, actually, that has to pre-exist your candidacy. You have to have opinions and policies and a reason. Either you want to win the office and implement certain policies, or at least you want to raise certain issues in the campaign. If you don't know that, then you shouldn't be running yet.
Yeah, I always try to start people with, before they start trying to get me to tell them why they should run, which I think is always a trap, as you mentioned. I try to get people to say, look, get away by yourself for at least an hour or a couple hours, take a legal pad, turn your phone off, get a cup of coffee or your favorite adult beverage, and go sit by yourself for a couple hours and just start writing. And this is all about why you're running. So it revolves around 3 main questions. Why me? So why am I running? Why now? So why is this my moment? And why am I running for this specific office? Why not Congress or president or dog catcher? And you get that and just say, look, don't have a structure to it. Just put everything you can get out of your head. Try to just verbally vomit on the piece of paper, get it all out there. And that's going to be your first and I think most important campaign strategic document, because that gets the unfiltered, unbiased, unedited version of why you're in this race. And then from there, I tell them, look, this is where you'll start to edit it a little bit. You'll run it past your consultant, your kitchen cabinet, your spouse, and we start to identify, okay, so out of the 20 things that you talked about that are motivations policy-wise, what are the couple most important and ones that we think will resonate the most that are probably shared by the most people in your district? Okay, well, now we got a couple, and let's narrow it down to those handful that you talked about, and let's shape this document take it from shapeless to defined, and let's structure our main campaign speeches, a longer form speech, a short speech, elevator pitch, those kind of things. And you're able to have consistency across the messaging, you're able to be focused on the issues, and you're able to make sure that you start out in all ways from the candidate's heart. And then from there, you can kind of take the final shape through help with the consultants. But meetings I've had where a consultant tried to do all the talking for the candidate about why they're running, or where the candidate was asking me more questions and telling me more things about why they were in the race, those always worry me.
Yeah, and I find just in 2017, and I don't want to mention any names, but I had a number of local candidates. Some won, some lost, some were excellent, and some were skilled politicians. Some were, excellent the first time out of the box. And I had two that were not very successful. One was running in a district where they were not going to be able to win. Okay, and they kind of knew that, so that's okay. But they were just a general conservative. And when I asked her why she's running, she couldn't really articulate it. And I pointed out to her, I said, see, that's a problem, that you're not, you're a conservative and you believe in conservative policies. But she was running against but what's the reason you're running? Because I said, there's plenty of people, half the people in the country, right? Maybe a third of the people in our state, maybe a quarter of the people in our county. But, there's plenty of people who are conservative and have conservative opinions. That's not enough of a reason to run.
No.
And And then, the person she was running against was popular and was elected many times, and had some minor, accusations against him. Minor, not coming up to any scandal level at all. But there were, some hotheads in the community that were talking to my prospective candidate, saying that she should run and in order to embarrass and put a personal attack on this person and, hit them really hard on personal issues. And they were telling her that she could win that way. And so I was saying that you can't win in this district, but you could make, some progress on some issues, raising issues. But she liked hearing that she could win if she was personally attacking
right.
the person. But that it doesn't really achieve very much. She doesn't win and ends up not really hurting that person, and nobody is, the community is not any more smart or intelligent. Another candidate had a little bit of a reputation before she was a candidate of getting into arguments, crazy arguments on she was running for city council, but she had a reputation for arguing on Facebook and, getting back and forth, getting down and dirty, trading insults. Well, she had lost in 2015 with 49% of the vote. So she had a chance to win in this race. And she was well-known business. But we told her during the campaign, tone it down and be cautious in what you put on social media. Run it through us. And since you're running for city council, don't bring in, the national issues. In fact, that your opponent is probably going to want to bring in the national issues because you're running in King County, Washington State, a liberal, leaning area. Even though she's in a suburb, it was maybe a winnable race. Well, not only did she not follow our advice, and she was happy with us. She paid us. She loved us. She said, but sometimes she just wanted to go her own way. She got into a major argument over immigration and said, and I'm a hardliner, against illegal immigration, but she's running for city council in some small, suburb. That's not the key issue. So she got into big arguments on that issue on Facebook. It was not one of her three key issues for running. And then the local newspaper, Seattle Times, had a front page article on supposed racism and anti-immigrant phobia, in that council race. And they didn't even mention her. They just attacked all the conservative candidates who got mixed up in it. And she lost, and one incumbent conservative lost in, getting pulled into that. I'm mentioning, some of the negative examples only to say not so much. I mean, if you're a potential candidate listening to this, I hope you take it with, for sincere, helpful advice, but especially to the consultants, because that's where if you want to talk about persuasion, you have to convince someone to actually, if they have a little bit of a hothead, tell them, hey, you're a little bit of a hothead, and, hold off, while you're running. This is not going to help you. And you have to use your skill and your persuasion to, get them back. That's why, I prefer that candidates come to me when they're thinking of running for office, rather than after they already had their press conference, already, just randomly spoke on several issues and gotten into controversies. And now they want to, could you manage my campaign? And, they've already kind of frame themselves in a certain way. That's not always bad. They may have done it, happen to do a good job. But I prefer to have it up front, because that way you can establish the focus on messaging. I mentioned the Holy Trinity. Fundraising is the second part. And, a lot of candidates, they want to make speeches. They want to write position papers. They want to answer complicated questionnaires. They want to, have lengthy campaign meetings over, deep policy, which, wouldn't be applicable unless they were elected to the legislature or to the city council. And it's hard to convince someone to say everything you're doing is to raise money, because whatever you're going to do, let's assume you're doing good. But if nobody hears about it and nobody sees your yard signs and nobody gets phone calls from your volunteers and nobody gets flyers in the mail and nobody hears your radio commercials, all of those things cost money. So you have to be asking, every event is a fundraising event. Every encounter to want to, and that means that the candidate is the product. They're the salesman, they're the sales manager, and they're the owner of the company.
Yeah.
And, you and I, we probably, by the nature of our work, we're, at least to some extent, and anybody who's going to be a self-employed political consultant or have a consulting company and any kind of marketing, branding, messaging, comms, public relations, you have to have a somewhat entrepreneurial and sales personality. Mm-hmm. And not everybody does, and there's nothing wrong if you don't. But unfortunately, to be a candidate in a competitive race, and even if you're running in a race where you can't win, but you truly want to get out your message, if you don't raise money, it doesn't matter what your plan is, because nobody will know about it, and you will be, your name will be mentioned. They'll have an article about all the candidates in the primary and, their personalities and pictures. And then the last paragraph will say, also running is Joe Smith, Mary Jones, and Harvey Williams. And you'll be Harvey Williams. And so that, they'll just say they're also on the ballot, but are not running a significant campaign. And then people hate that. They get mad. And I call it, have you had, Raz, where someone runs and they don't really know what they're doing, maybe in a district that they can't win, and they lose. They didn't know they were going to lose, and they're mad at everybody. They're mad at their volunteers. Oh, yeah. They're mad at the county party. Why didn't you, give me money? Why didn't you support me? And I call that candidate-itis. And I try to inoculate in advance against that.
Well, there's two things I always tell candidates that your primary job is two things: is talking to voters and talking to donors. So if it doesn't involve direct voter contact or donor contact, you're going to have to fight me pretty hard to get things on your schedule that don't meet those two criteria. Mm-hmm. And there was a guy I was working with a year or so ago that was running for Congress up in Oklahoma. And he had this visceral hatred of asking anybody for money. He knew he needed it, and he put in an enormous amount himself. He self-funded a lot, really stretched his own financial limitations to do that. And his wife's a doctor, and he was former military, and he had some significant resources to put there. But throughout that whole process, I was like, you know what? You've got to be asking for money. He's like, well, we've got to. I put in a bunch. Why do we need to ask for money? I was like, well, one, you need more than you put in, but two, it's part of this process of getting investment from people. Because the people that give you money, whether it's $3 or $300 or $3,000, that means they're invested in a different way, and they're going to help support you both in front of you and elsewhere in a different way. And he ran a great race. He refused to ask for us money. He lost, but he ran a respectable race, and he's come back. He's running in this cycle. And when he called me to tell me that he was running, I was like, okay, well, what did you learn last time that's going to make a difference this time around? And he said, well, Raz, the biggest thing for me is if it breathes, if it moves, I'm asking it for money. And I was like, you know what? That's exactly what I wanted to hear. That's the biggest area of improvement you had available to you, and that's going to make a huge difference in the outcomes.
Mm-hmm. And I explain to people, even if you're on, 5 minutes on, you're getting 5 minutes on whatever the drive time on that city's talk radio show, right? Okay, that's golden, that's free, right? And you're going to answer whatever questions, and you're going to try to get your message, but you're going to tell them, if you can remember, and if you should, go to the website, and you're going to tell them whatever your next speaking engagement or or event is, and these events, are fundraisers, whether they're, called fundraisers or not. And the website, uh, nowadays, and I saw an article on LinkedIn, recently about, it said, please, if your company has a website, please tell me what you're about. I can't, I'm not going to read through hundreds and hundreds of paragraphs.
Yeah. Well,
right?
And one of the funny things is you mentioned the branding and making sure you're directing people to follow up information. I used to work for Ted Cruz, and it became a trademark that, it didn't matter whether he was on the radio, on Facebook, on TV, wherever it was, he would always give his web address. Yeah, see, you still remember it. He'd always say it 3 times, tedcruz.org, tedcruz.org, tedcruz.org. He made sure you heard it. He knew that if he just said it, it was short and sweet, and you probably wouldn't get your attention. But 3 times, it might be a little bit annoying for those of us that heard him, a couple times a day do that. But you know what? You still remember it, and you're from Washington State.
Right. And I was, I caucused for Cruz, and to this day, I still get, the email say, email tonight, 6 p.m., conference call, special information from Ted Cruz. And then, I always put on speakerphone. Then my wife is all excited, but then she's, hey, this is just asking for money, indirectly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And you're like, exactly. He's doing a good job.
Now, of course, I've sat down with donors and I do tell candidates they have to be the salesman. That doesn't mean that they won't have other people, especially in a statewide race, that will raise money. And, I was on the staff of the Washington State Republican Party. My company put me to be on staff of the Washington State Republican Party, and I was in charge of new media technology and comms and press relations. But there was one person who I even though I wasn't the finance person, I over time convinced them to make a donation of $5,000, and then that person was kind of felt they're invested in the Republican Party, and later they became, a candidate that actually they have strong and weak points as a candidate, but they raised a good amount of money in their first race. When someone even gives 25, think about it. If someone gives $25, or one of the people who just sends $10, right? In these, Ted Cruz calls or Newt Gingrich calls, they don't. If you want to give $5, great, because then they get your name. They get your email. They know that the phone call on immigration policy or the phone call on tax policy is what made you interested. And then they have information about you that's golden or platinum. And plus, on your side, you're just someone 70 years old on Social Security. You don't have much money. And for the first time in your life, you send $10. You feel like you are part of the campaign. You've invested in it. And sometimes there'll be a working person. When I ran for office, there were people, just regular people that, heard me speak or, saw what my campaign was doing. Or in other cases, when I was campaign manager, they would like the candidate. And it'd just be a working person who would not, they would go to McDonald's. They're not going to go to a fancy restaurant. And they decided, they talk with their wife and they give $100. That's a big deal. That's like, a whole day of movies and restaurants. That's a big deal. They feel like they're, as far as they know, that's like a lot of money. And then they feel they love that candidate, and they care about that candidate. They pay, from then on, they pay more attention. So messaging,
widows might.
Right. Messaging, fundraising, and then name recognition, which, if you're running in a local area, that's my third part of the holy trinity of campaigning. If you're running in a district or a city council, okay, you're going to doorbell you yourself as a candidate and volunteers and others. But some of these races, there's not that many volunteers. It's you, your wife, a few friends. So you wear out your shoes. You hit every door you can. And, it's a little different if you're running, if you're running for, in a big city or a state race. Obviously, you're not going to doorbell millions, but you'll do other things like buy a lot of radio commercials, have a lot of speaking engagements, have lots of printed materials, yard signs and mailers and flyers and position, issue statements mailed out to people, robocalls. I'm a big proponent of robocalls, even though have you ever had a client that will say, well, I get a lot of negative feedback. We did a robocall once. Let's say they call, 500,000 robocalls, and we got dozens of complaints, right? Well, first of all, dozens to 500,000, you got your name out to 500,000, and it's one of the, cheapest, least expensive ways. And I know that sometimes people will call back and they'll say, stop calling me. If you call me again, I'm not going to vote for you. I'll vote for the other guy. But, that's not really true. No. Because, first of all, they probably don't know. If they're so mad, they might not even know which candidate is which. And they get robocalls from both candidates anyway. And actually, if you are for abortion and against the Second Amendment and for cutting the military and for raising taxes, and the liberal candidate gives you a robocall that bothers you, you're still not going to vote for the Republican guy.
No.
And, nobody is a single issue. If you do a robocall, I'm going to vote for the other party. That's not going to happen. And
yeah, it's the kind of thing I hear about every election cycle. And I'm just like, look, that doesn't make sense. Now, don't be annoying with them. And that's the same thing with your live calls, everything else. Don't be annoying about it. But at the end of the day, if somebody's telling you that, they're either lying to you because they don't actually take that seriously, they're just trying to scare you, or they were never going to vote for you, so they're lying to you in that way. It's just, I've heard about this voter who changes their opinion based on robocalls and voter contact every election cycle, and I've never met them, and I've looked really hard.
And if that was true, there wouldn't be millions, and probably billions, of robocalls, right? Yeah. Because there's thousands of races making many thousands of robocalls, multiple calls. If it was really helping the other candidate, no, it wouldn't have. Both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton made as far, millions and millions. I'll tell you one of the interesting things, and this gets back to me and my company, One Spark Marketing, and I'm a one-man show, self-employed. I have contractors that do, things for me, and I work with vendors, and I'm often a middleman. Well, what at first, when someone's, some candidate wanted to do robocalls, so I'd never done robocall before. I contact a robocall provider, and this was, 2011, and they said, okay, yeah, 5 cents. Think of that. That's a very high price for a robocall. 5 cents per successful call. Why? Because I was, representing a tiny candidate in a tiny city, and it was only going to be a few thousand. Okay. Well, still, it was not very expensive because a few thousand times 5 cents, it was like, a couple $100. The candidate did it. It actually helped the candidate, and they won for other reasons. And but what happened was, I thought, wow, that was pretty easy. And so I started doing, more. And then, the next year when I had several candidates, someone mentioned to me, well, I was able to get a lower rate. So I called the vendor. I said, hey, look, I've done some business with you. They said, oh, boom, they lowered me to 2 cents. And this was maybe 2014. Then I said, well, what do I need to do to get, and I would do this every few months. What do I need to do to get to 1.8 and so on, lower and lower. I don't want to give away, what my price is. But what ended up happening was they, at one point they said, well, look, if you do X million of calls and pay us in advance, which would mean I would have to get the candidate or candidates to pay in advance, pay us in advance, then we will give you X. And again, I don't want to say what my low rate is. But what happened is, just due to unique circumstances and my aggressiveness and the fact that in Washington State, a lot of the Republican and conservative leaning consultants, well, it's a tough state, and especially in the Seattle area. So nobody else was doing it, and boom, I'm able often to beat the lowest robocall rates, even of major companies, because I ended up doing many millions of robocalls for many candidates and party organizations. So, and that was because I took my business model of yes. I think I mentioned this to you before we began, the podcast. My business background was on the organizational side of tech startups in Seattle. So I wasn't exactly a tech person, but I did have political background, and I had run for Congress. So people knew of me. And so when the economic downturn came and I got laid off on Christmas Eve 2008 by the tech company where I was director of operations for the West Coast.
Wow. Merry Christmas.
Yeah, it was Christmas Eve. Oh, man.
Gosh.
And then, until then, whenever that had happened in the past in my life, a few weeks go by, you get another job. But it wasn't, 2009 was really terrible. So a friend of mine was in the same situation. We met with each other and we networked with each other. And I got on Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn. And then, he said to me, here's your first client. I said, what do you mean? And he showed me a chocolate beverage, and it was a niche product for endurance athletes, but it was also a product that worked for, it was the exact hypoglycemic content or something that diabetics could have it, and endurance athletes. And so this beverage company was, going to promote their chocolate drink. And they didn't know anything about Twitter and Facebook. He says, well, you know about Twitter and Facebook. Tell them you'll do it. And that was my first client. And I charged them a really high price because I had no idea what to charge. They were happy, and they referred me to other people. And I took the approach of business model of yes, that if someone asks me to do something, yes, we can do that because somebody can do it. And I will find a contractor. And I want to tell you about how, one time very early on, only once, I had a candidate, who had agreed to pay me a monthly fee to run her campaign, stiffed me and didn't pay me. And it, kind of burned me on it. But it made me rethink my pricing. And except for that situation, I've never been, stiffed or had a client refuse to pay. Now, in political campaigns, I tell people, look, if I was doing a website or yard signs or robocalls or whatever, but if I'm doing consulting for a company, well, they're going to be around. Hey, if they miss a payment, they'll pay me double the next month, or they'll still be there. Your campaign disappears on November, and especially if you lose the election,
yeah.
Right? So I will say, for tangible items where I have to lay out money, they have to pay in advance. But this is the type of discussion that I will have. Somebody asks me to do something, and we'll do robocalls, printed materials, we'll do mailings, we'll do Oppo research, yard signs, web development, social media maintenance, email marketing, whatever. Someone asks me to do something, I say, yes, we do that. And then let's say, I'm just going to take an example. Some campaign wants, we create a website, design it, and coordinate it with Twitter and Facebook, right? I have a person who is a regular contractor with me, and I'll tell them, hey, here's such and such candidate, wants such and such website, blah blah blah, and I'll set up a meeting I'll tell the candidate, hey, I want you to talk to my guy, he's the expert, tell him what you need, and the two of you will talk, blah blah blah. But I tell the contractor, don't get into pricing. If they ask you about pricing, say, I'm going to talk to Steve about that, but I want to know what you need. Okay, then the person tells me the contractor comes to me, says, look, I met with the candidate. He wants such and such XYZ, ABC. I say, well, how much do you want for that? Let's say he says $2,000. And I'll say, are you sure? What if he turns out to be a pain in the neck, high maintenance guy? Are you going to be happy with $2,000? Because if you say $2,000, I'm going to give you $2,000. I'm not going to give you $1,900, and I'm not going to give you $2,100. Whether the guy is a pain in the neck or the easiest and low maintenance and doesn't even do anything, I'm not going to give you a penny more, penny less. And sometimes they say, yeah, $2,000, or they might say, well, no, how about $2,200? I say, fine. I say, I'm going to pay you $2,200. Then I decide how much profit I want to make. So let's say in this case, I want to make $500, right? I tell the candidate, $2,700. And that way I know I'm going to be able to pay the contractor and I'm going to have what I want. Let me go back. If my contractor says, no, I'm not going to do that unless I get X, Y, or Z price, I make sure I have a price that the contractor will do it. Now I go to the candidate. Hey, this is going to cost you $2,700. If they say no, I say, fine, we don't do it. It won't get done. They're going to have to go to somebody else. They might come back to me anyway when they find out our price was okay. But the price is agreed to. And if the candidate says, well, okay, $2,700, I'll say, well, look, sometimes these websites and social media are much easier. Sometimes it's very complicated. No matter how complicated it is, we're not going to charge you a penny more. Of course, no matter how easy it is, we're not going to charge you a penny less. I have that kind of discussion with them. Maybe this will be helpful to people in any kind of business, but in political consulting where you're trying, to get money up front and you don't want to be in the middle of a campaign having a dispute or, chasing a candidate to pay you, right? So you want to have as much as possible agreement up front about the pricing. So that's my approach. And it may not, it may be my personality is exactly suited for that particular approach. Others may have other approaches that are successful, but that's what I use to minimize the need for collection and for chasing after money and to minimize dissatisfaction by candidate or by contractor.
Yeah, I think the beautiful thing about that is that if you get everything hashed out ahead of time, then that does minimize that opportunity for frustration and somebody feel like they didn't get what they thought they were getting. I know there's, for those of you that are listening that are thinking about getting into political consulting or trying to figure out how you make money and make politics a full-time job, just know that there are about as many different pricing schemes and models as there are consultants. That's one of the fun things about being your own boss is that you get to come up with what works for you, both your personality and the type of people you work with. But I know that a good friend of mine is a consultant. He has his style is he has a flat retainer and he does not charge. He'll charge for extra activity that goes beyond the original scope of work, but he takes zero upcharge on any like throughput services. For him, that works great. His clients love that transparency. For others, they have they take a cut because they're putting together their relationship with the vendors, and they have those. That's a value add that they provide, and so they deserve a cut of that, and so that's part of their relationship. Their clients know that up front. Whatever it is, just make sure at the outset that you're making everything very, very clear. That the candidate knows whether you may sometimes take an upcharge or not. That I feel like that's important, and that throughout the process that you're getting as much in writing as possible. That way you can remind people, because sometimes I've had clients that would say, "Well, I didn't approve." I do door knocking for them, and they'd say, "Well, why did you charge for that? I didn't say yes to that." And if you've got that in an email somewhere, you can go back to him, forward it to him. So, well, at this, March 3rd, you said that was a really good idea and that we should do it immediately. So that's why you're being billed for it. Alternatively, if it's just a phone call, then that's a little bit harder to be able to say, well, when we talked back on, I see my phone, we talked on March 3rd. And I remember us saying that was a good idea. And then 2 months later, you're getting billed for it. That sometimes is harder and you risk the relationship more. So Steve, as we're kind of getting towards the end of our time, any closing words of wisdom for folks that are thinking about getting into consulting for themselves and trying to make a business out of politics?
Yeah, some words of wisdom and a little a little promotion, self-promotion too. But I will say your last comment fits into the words of wisdom, because it's excellent, because if you establish good communication and integrity on the pricing and on the financial side of it, that adds to and fits in with overall integrity on whatever advice and political suggestions and strategies. And that builds relationships. And, everybody says on LinkedIn and on social media, relationships. So also, like you said, you're your own boss. And so whatever your model is, you take a cut, you don't, you have a retainer, you have a monthly fee, all of those models are all valid. There is a satisfaction to being your own boss and being self-employed. That means that whatever money you created, you made that money occur. So that is a very good feeling. It's not for everybody, but I love it. I will, say to people who are listening, I want to encourage people to find me on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. And my name's Steve Beren, STEVEBEREN, and that's all one word on Twitter, Steve Beren, all one word on Instagram, Steve Beren, and easy to find me on Facebook and on LinkedIn, Steve Beren, Seattle. And the name of my company is One Spark Marketing. And some of your listeners, if they're in the Portland, Oregon area or the Southwest Washington State area, on Saturday, April 14th, the Cowlitz County Republican Party is having their Lincoln dinner. This is a big event. It's a conservative-leaning area. I've spoken at that event in previous year, and I'm the keynote speaker. And it's at the Cowlitz County Event Center in Longview, Washington, Saturday evening, April 14th. I'm going to be there. I'm the keynoter. Also on the program is Congresswoman Jamie Herrera Butler, Republican, 3rd District, Southwest Washington State. It'll be a great program as we head into the 2018 elections. And my theme is going to be victory strategy for Republicans in 2018.
Fantastic. Well, I know plenty of Republicans that need a victory strategy this year, as generic ballot's not looking too good and control of the House is in the balance. That's it's an important topic. So, folks, you can look in the show notes here to get links to all of Steve's profiles that he mentioned. You can Google him. One Spark Marketing, the numeral 1, sparkmarketing.com is his website. You can look it up there. If you're in the Portland or Southwest Washington area, go check him out here in a couple of weeks. Steve, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much for being on and your great work. I look forward to our listeners getting to check this out and give us some feedback.
Thank you very much. Great talking with you. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, sir. All right, guys, thanks again for tuning in today. I had a blast talking to Steve, and I hope you guys got plenty of good tips out of the episode. All the links to his content information and how to check out his website and social media presence are in the show notes. So just click over from iTunes to our blog post to get those and to contact Steve. Don't forget to shoot me the information you might have about how we can serve y'all better and ideas for future guests. My email is raz, R-A-Z, at mycampaigncoach.com, and you can find us for a Facebook message via searching for My Campaign Coach on Facebook. The Elite Campaign Mastermind is our Facebook group, and I look forward to talking to you guys again very soon.
Please subscribe and rate us on iTunes to help spread the word. We'll be back with you next week with more campaign insights from My Campaign Coach.